A veteran who retreated to the frozen mountains for peace, never imagined that silence itself could be weaponized. He trusted the snow, the solitude, and the steady rhythm of days meant only for survival. But his German shepherd, trained by instinct, not comfort, suddenly stopped on a familiar trail, ears pinned forward, body locked in warning. Then the dog ran. Moments later, smoke rose through the trees like a signal no one was meant to see. A helicopter lay broken in the ravine below, metal twisted, snow melting into ash. Inside was a journalist who barely had the strength to whisper one sentence before losing consciousness. This wasn't an accident. From that moment on, a quiet life ended. What followed was not a rescue, but an awakening. Beneath the snow were machines never meant to exist, signals designed to silence the sky, and a truth powerful enough to bury an entire town in fear. A respected foundation, a smiling benefactor, a lawman who chose silence over justice. And at the center of it all stood a veteran who didn't want to be a hero, and a dog who refused to look away when danger called. If this story speaks to you, please support the channel by subscribing and stay until the end. Some truths only surface when someone is brave enough to listen. Stellan Duvik was 46 when silence became his refuge. A former mountain rescue operative, he had spent years pulling strangers from avalanches, collapsed structures, and frozen ravines. Until one winter night, when a delayed signal cost 2 lives under his command. The investigation cleared him. His conscience did not. Since then, Stellan slept lightly, trusted animals more than people, and retreated into the mountains where responsibility was simple. Survive, prepare, and never ignore a warning again. Snow lay thin and dry over Frostmere's upper trails, reflecting pale winter sunlight without softening the cold. A weak noon sun hovered low above the Garnet Crown Range, offering light but little warmth. Stellan moved steadily along the narrow mountainside path, boots crunching with measured rhythm against frozen soil and old needles. He carried the solid build of a man shaped by years of physical labor and controlled urgency. Broad shoulders, a deep chest, and arms corded with strength that had learned restraint. His beard was kept short and uneven, dark with streaks of iron gray along the jawline. The cold had carved fine lines into his weathered face, especially around his eyes the color of river stone, alert even in peace. He wore a heavy wool-lined jacket, faded brown and patched at the elbows, with a coil of rope and a hatchet slung across his back. He wasn't searching for trouble. He was gathering fallen wood and checking old animal traps, small practical acts meant to keep his cabin warm through the long nights still ahead. Beside him walked Vargo. The German shepherd moved with fluid confidence, making uneven terrain look effortless. 5 years old, large-framed but lean, Vargo's coat carried deep black across his back, dark gray along his flanks, and pale cream threading his chest and legs like frost trapped in fur. His ears stood alert even at rest, swiveling independently to catch distant sounds. Amber eyes, sharp and intelligent, scanned the tree line with a focus that felt less like training and more like instinct. His olive-green harness bore scratches from years of brush and stone, but it fit him like a second skin. Vargo was calm by nature, observant, deeply loyal, and he had never once been wrong about danger. Stellan trusted that more than he trusted people. The trail curved along a steep slope. Pines rose dense and dark on one side, while the land dropped sharply on the other, opening to a view of Frostmere Valley below. White roofs, scattered like bone fragments, thin smoke drifting from chimneys. Stellan paused, letting cold air fill his lungs. Peace lived here, fragile but honest. The mountains didn't ask who he used to be. Vargo stopped. Not abruptly, not startled. He simply froze mid-step, one paw lifted, body locked into stillness so complete it felt unnatural. His ears snapped forward, tail lowered, gaze fixed downhill as if something unseen had crossed his senses. "What is it, boy?" Stellan murmured. Vargo did not turn. His breathing slowed, muscles coiled beneath thick fur. A familiar tension settled into Stellan's chest, the quiet warning that once came before alarms and collapsing ice. He followed Vargo's line of sight, but the forest offered nothing except gently swaying branches. Then Vargo moved. Without a sound, the shepherd spun and bolted downhill, tearing through brush with explosive urgency, snow spraying beneath powerful legs. Stellan swore and ran after him, boots slipping once on loose gravel before finding purchase. Vargo did not run like an animal chasing prey. He ran like something racing toward disaster. The scent hit first, burning fuel, sharp and chemical, slicing through pine and frost. Smoke rose ahead, thin and twisting, dark against the winter sky. Stellan broke through the last stand of firs and stopped. A small service helicopter lay wrecked in a shallow ravine, its frame torn open like a broken rib cage. One rotor blade had snapped clean off and embedded itself in the dirt yards away. Heat shimmered above twisted metal. Snow around the wreck had melted into black slush. "This shouldn't be here," Stellan muttered. The sky had been clear, no storm, no warning. Vargo circled the wreckage, barking sharply once, then stopping at the cockpit where glass had shattered inward. His hackles rose, a low whine vibrating in his throat, not fear, but urgency. Stellan slid down the ravine, heat washing over him as he reached the cockpit. Inside, slumped against the harness, was a woman. She looked to be in her early 30s. Frank brown hair pulled into a tight ponytail, now streaked with blood at her temple. Pale skin beneath soot, faint freckles across her cheeks. One hand hung limp, the other clutched a leather notebook to her chest, as if by instinct. Her breathing was shallow, but present. Stellan grabbed the door handle, jammed. Flames crept closer beneath the engine housing. He wrapped his jacket around his forearm and smashed the remaining glass with his elbow. Pain flared, but the glass gave way. He fumbled with the harness buckle until it released. Vargo barked louder. "I've got her," Stellan said. He pulled her free, lifting her weight over his shoulder. She was lighter than expected. The helicopter groaned behind him. He ran. Snow and dirt blurred beneath his boots as he climbed. 10 seconds later, the fuel tank detonated. Heat slammed into his back. He dove behind a fallen log, curling around the woman instinctively, shielding her as ash and sparks rained down. When the sound faded, the forest fell silent. The woman stirred weakly. Her eyes fluttered open just long enough to focus on nothing. With effort that stole her breath, she whispered, "Not an accident. They jammed it." Then she went still. Vargo stood at the edge of the clearing, rigid, staring into the trees beyond the smoke. His fur bristled, teeth glinted. Stellan followed his gaze and felt the old dread settle deep in his bones. Someone had been watching. He had only wanted firewood, only wanted quiet. Instead, the mountain had placed a truth in his arms, and Vargo, unyielding, faithful, had refused to walk past it. By the time Stellan reached his cabin, dusk was already tightening its grip on the forest, the light thinning into a bruised blue that bled slowly between the trees. Snow had begun to fall again, soft at first, then heavier, each flake catching briefly in the air before vanishing against bark, roof, and wool. The cabin sat half-buried against the slope, built from rough-cut logs darkened by age and weather, its single window glowing faintly as if the mountain itself were holding a breath inside. Stellan eased Maris down from his shoulder at the threshold, careful despite the stiffness in his arms and the ache blooming across his ribs from the blast. He shouldered the door open with his hip and stepped inside, letting warmth and the dry scent of old pine wash over them. The fire was low but alive, coals glowing red beneath a careful stack of split wood. He laid her gently on the narrow leather couch, easing her boots off, setting her jacket aside. Her breathing remained shallow but steady, lips pale, brow creased with pain, even in unconsciousness. Vargo followed them in last, snow clinging to his fur like white ash. He shook once, then immediately stilled. Instead of settling near the fire as he usually did, the shepherd paced the length of the room, nose low, ears twitching. He stopped at the door, then the window, then the floor near the hearth, lowering his head until one ear nearly brushed the planks. A low sound vibrated in his chest, quiet, continuous, not a growl, but something closer to listening given voice. Stellan noticed. He always did. "Easy," he murmured, though his own pulse hadn't slowed. He closed the door, slid the heavy wooden bolt into place, and fed the fire another log. Outside, wind rose sharply, driving snow sideways into the walls. The cabin creaked and settled, an old animal bracing itself against the cold. Minutes stretched. The light faded completely. Night claimed Frostmere with the speed that only winter allowed. Maris stirred. She came back to consciousness in fragments, the orange pulse of firelight, the smell of smoke and resin, the dull ache behind her eyes that pulsed in time with her heartbeat. When she tried to sit up, pain flared along her ribs, sharp enough to draw a gasp from her throat. She froze, breathing shallowly until the wave passed. "Don't," Stellan said quietly from the stove. "You cracked something. Not bad enough to keep you down, but enough to remind you to stay put." His voice was calm, even, but carried the weight of someone used to emergencies. Maris turned her head toward the sound. He stood in profile, tall, broad, silhouetted by the fire as he poured water into a blackened kettle. In the flickering light, she caught the angles of his face: strong nose, squared jaw, short beard shot through with gray. His movements were economical, precise, as if wasted effort offended him. "Where?" Her throat felt raw. "My cabin," he replied. "You're safe, for now." That last part wasn't reassurance. It was honesty. She swallowed, eyes adjusting. "The helicopter?" "Gone." Memory rushed back in a blur of sound and white heat. Her fingers tightened against the blanket. "That wasn't a malfunction," she said, voice hoarse but steady. "I know what turbulence feels like. That was interference, directional, deliberate." Stellan didn't answer immediately. He set the kettle on the stove, then turned to face her fully. Up close, she saw the exhaustion in his eyes, not sleep-deep tiredness, but the kind that came from carrying too many outcomes in your head. "You said something like that before you passed out," he said, "about jamming." "Yes," she nodded once, carefully. "I was coming to Frostmere because someone reached out to me. Anonymous. They said this valley isn't quiet by accident, that communications here are being cut intentionally. Not dead zones, not geography. A system." The word hung between them. Vargo stopped pacing and planted himself between Maris and the door, body angled protectively, eyes fixed on the narrow gap between the curtains. Snow tapped softly against the glass, but the dog's attention didn't waver. Stellan followed his gaze. "He's been like that since we got here." Maris noticed the dog properly then, even injured, even shaken. The sight of Vargo brought a strange calm. He was magnificent in a restrained way, power without restlessness, alertness without panic. "He pulled you to the wreck, didn't he?" she asked. "He never runs without a reason," Stellan said. "And he never watches like this unless something's reminding him of trouble." She exhaled slowly. "Your dog might be the reason I'm alive." Vargo's ears flicked at her voice. Then he returned to listening, lowering his head toward the floorboards again. The low vibration in his chest resumed, just audible beneath the wind. Maris frowned. "What is he hearing?" Stellan didn't answer right away. He knelt beside the fire, poked at the coals, more to give his hands something to do than out of necessity. "Sometimes," he said finally, "he hears things before they happen." The cabin fell quiet except for the storm. Wind clawed at the roof. Snow built up against the walls, sealing the world outside, layer by layer. Maris shifted slightly, wincing. "The source didn't tell me everything," she said. "Just enough to get me here. They said there was equipment in this region capable of generating low-frequency pulses, not constant, intermittent, strong enough to disrupt aircraft navigation, emergency radios, even satellite uplinks, if timed right." Stellan's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "Why here?" She met his gaze. "Because no one looks twice at a dying mountain town. Because isolation can be framed as nature. And because when things go wrong in places like this, people call it weather." The kettle began to hiss. Stellan poured hot water into a chipped mug and brought it to her, helping her drink. She noticed his hands, scarred, steady, shaking only slightly as he held the cup. Not fear. Recognition. Outside, a sound cut through the storm. Not wind, not a tree. A distant engine, faint but real, passed somewhere far down the valley, then faded. Vargo's head snapped up. His body stiffened. The low sound in his chest deepened into something closer to a warning. "You heard that too?" Maris whispered. "Yes," Stellan said. They didn't move. They didn't speak. The engine didn't return. Minutes passed, maybe more. Time inside the cabin bent strangely, stretched by snow and firelight. Stellan straightened slowly. "I didn't want to get involved," he said, more to himself than to her. "I came up here to stop making decisions that cost lives." Maris studied him, reading between words. "And yet you ran into fire for a stranger." He looked at her then, truly looked, and something unspoken shifted. "I don't ignore warnings anymore," he said quietly. "Not after last time." Vargo pressed his nose briefly to Stellan's knee, then returned to his post, staring into the dark as if memorizing it. Maris drew the blanket tighter around herself. "If I'm right," she said, "someone in Frostmere knows exactly what's happening. And if they know, they're either scared or paid not to say anything." The wind howled harder, rattling the window. Snow slid from the roof in a heavy rush. Stellan felt the cabin shrink around them, not physically, but in the way truth did when it arrived uninvited. He had wanted quiet. Instead, the mountain had delivered a choice. He looked at the dog, then at the woman on his couch, then at the door that separated them from a buried, watching world. "You rest," he said. "Storm like this won't let anyone move easily tonight." "And tomorrow?" she asked. He didn't answer. Vargo let out a single low sound. Not a growl, not a bark. Something between agreement and warning, his eyes never leaving the dark beyond the glass. Whatever had followed her to Frostmere hadn't left. It was only waiting. Morning arrived cautiously, as if Frostmere itself were unsure whether it was safe to wake. The storm that had battered the mountains through the night retreated into a low gray ceiling, leaving behind a world muffled by fresh snow and silence. The sky was neither bright nor dark, just pale enough to suggest time was moving again. Stellan cleared snow from his truck with methodical strokes, while Maris stood wrapped in a thick wool blanket near the porch, her movements slower but steadier than the night before. Vargo sat beside her, alert, watching the tree line as if memorizing the way shadows settled after a storm. The drive down the mountain took longer than usual. Snow had drifted unevenly across the narrow road, forcing Stellan to keep his speed low. His truck was old, faded green paint, rust at the wheel wells, engine humming with a tired but reliable rhythm. It was the kind of vehicle that didn't attract attention, which suited him just fine. Maris watched the forest slide past through the passenger window, her jaw tight, eyes sharp despite the bruise darkening along her temple. She looked like someone who had learned to function through pain, not because she enjoyed it, but because stopping had never been an option. Frostmere appeared gradually through the trees, a cluster of wooden buildings crouched against the valley like survivors of a long siege. The main road cut through town in a single line, flanked by a general store, a diner with a cracked sign, and a handful of shuttered businesses whose windows reflected the dull sky. Smoke rose from chimneys in thin columns, straight and controlled, as if even fire was expected to behave here. People moved slowly along the sidewalks, bundled tight, heads down, eyes averted. It was not the quiet of peace, it was the quiet of habit. Vargo shifted in the back seat as they rolled to a stop near the sheriff's office. His ears pricked, body tensing, nose working the air. Stellan noticed and killed the engine. "Stay," he said softly. Vargo obeyed, but his gaze remained fixed on the building ahead. The sheriff's office was a squat brick structure, its front sign newly painted, the letters bold and confident against the weathered surroundings. Sheriff Alden Crail stood just inside the doorway when they entered, as if he had been expecting them. He was in his mid-50s, tall but thick through the shoulders, with a face shaped by authority rather than kindness. His hair, once dark, had gone mostly gray, combed back neatly, and a trimmed mustache sat above lips that rarely curved into anything resembling a smile. His uniform was pressed, badge polished to a mirror sheen. Everything about him suggested control, order, and a man who did not appreciate surprises. He looked them over carefully, eyes lingering on Maris's bandaged head before settling on Stellan. "Morning," he said, voice flat. "What brings you down from the ridge so early?" Maris didn't wait for Stellan to answer. "My helicopter went down yesterday afternoon," she said, stepping forward despite the ache in her side. "Clear weather, no warning. I believe it was caused by deliberate interference." Krail's expression barely shifted. If there was surprise, he buried it quickly. "Accidents happen up here," he replied. "Mountains do strange things to signals." "Not like this," Maris said. "My navigation failed all at once. That's not terrain. That's a pulse." The sheriff sighed, as though indulging a stubborn child. "We've had low-frequency issues before. Weather patterns, solar activity. Unpredictable. Unfortunate timing." Stellan watched the man closely. Krail's words were smooth, practiced. Too practiced. "You're not even going to send someone to the site?" he asked quietly. "There's nothing left to inspect," Krail said. "Wreck burned hot and fast. I'll file a standard incident report." Maris felt something cold settle in her stomach. "Without measurements? Without checking for interference?" Krail's eyes hardened. "This conversation is over." Behind them, Vargo let out a low sound, not a bark, not a growl aimed at the sheriff, but something deeper, directed toward the side of the building. He stared toward a narrow alley running between the office and an adjacent storage shed. His hackles rose, nose twitching as if catching a scent that didn't belong. Krail noticed. "Control your dog." Stellan stepped slightly in front of Maris. "He doesn't react without a reason." The sheriff's jaw tightened. For a moment, something flickered behind his eyes. Irritation, perhaps, or something closer to unease. Then it vanished. "If there's nothing else," he said, turning away. They left without another word. Back outside, the cold felt sharper. Maris exhaled slowly, watching the sheriff retreat into his office. "He didn't even pretend to consider it," she said. "That wasn't dismissal. That was containment." Stellan nodded once. "He's protecting something, or someone." They drove out of town, the road narrowing as it slipped back into forest. For several minutes, neither spoke. The silence was broken only when Vargo suddenly stood, bracing himself against the seat. "Hold up," Stellan said, easing the truck to a stop. Vargo jumped down before the engine fully died, nose already to the ground. He moved along the roadside with focused urgency, circling once, then twice, before stopping near a patch of snow disturbed by tire tracks. He pawed lightly, then looked back at Maris, eyes intent. She stepped out, ignoring the twinge in her ribs, and knelt where Vargo indicated. Brushing snow aside, her fingers closed around a small metallic object half buried in pine needles. It was no bigger than her palm, dark gray, angular, with exposed circuitry along one edge. She turned it over carefully, breath catching. "This isn't consumer grade," she said softly. "Too compact, too dense." Stellan crouched beside her, recognition dawning with a weight he hadn't expected. "That's not aviation equipment." "No," Maris agreed. "It's closer to a frequency modulator, low band, portable." Vargo sniffed the ground again, then stiffened, ears forward, body angled toward the deeper woods. He took a step back, then another, as if whatever he sensed was not just present, but watching. A chill crept along Maris's spine. "You think this was used yesterday?" Stellan didn't answer immediately. He picked up the device, feeling its cold weight in his hand. "I think someone wanted your flight to disappear," he said finally. "And someone else wanted no questions asked. They stood there longer than was comfortable, the forest unnaturally still around them. Snow clung to branches, unmoving, no birds, no wind, just the quiet pressure of being observed. Maris straightened slowly.
"If the sheriff's involved," she said, "then Frostmere isn't just isolated. It's complicit." Stellan slipped the device into his jacket pocket. "Then we don't talk here," he said, "and we don't trust what wears a badge just because it shines." Vargo remained tense until they were back in the truck and moving again. Even then, he did not lie down. As Frostmere vanished behind the trees, Maris stared ahead, mind racing. The truth she had come for was closer now, sharper, and far more dangerous than she had expected. Stellan felt the same pull he had tried so hard to escape, the moment when silence becomes a choice, and every choice carries weight. The mountain had not let them pass. It had pointed them forward. The afternoon light was already thinning when Vargo led them off the main forest road, his pace deliberate, unwavering. Snow still clung to the trees from the previous storm, but here it lay disturbed, compressed, scraped, scarred in ways that did not belong to wind or animals. Stellan noticed it immediately. Maris did too. Only humans left marks like these, and pretended they were nature's doing. The sign appeared between the trees, like a warning carved into denial. Private conservation zone, authorized personnel only. The metal plate was bolted to a thick wooden post, the paint clean, recent, out of place in a forest where everything else wore age honestly. Beneath the official language sat a smaller plaque bearing a name etched in confident letters. Brenrick Holst Foundation. Maris stopped walking. "Holst," she said quietly. "That's not a local name." Stellan shook his head. "No one around here owns land this deep unless they want to disappear." Vargo didn't pause to read. He moved along the fence line, nose skimming the snow, tail low, ears angled forward. The fence itself was tall, steel mesh reinforced with posts sunk deep into frozen ground. It wasn't meant to keep wildlife out. It was meant to keep people from wandering too close to something expensive. They followed Vargo along the perimeter until he stopped abruptly at a section where the snow had drifted higher than the rest. He pressed his head against the ground, ears flattening, and released a sharp, uneasy whine. His paws began to dig, snow spraying backward in fast, controlled bursts. "Vargo," Stellan warned softly, though his body was already tensing. The shepherd ignored him. Within seconds, the snow gave way to something darker beneath. Packed earth, then a metal edge disguised under white paint and pine debris. Vargo recoiled suddenly, shaking his head, a low, rasping sound tearing from his throat. Not fear, alarm. Maris knelt, brushing snow aside with numb fingers. "This isn't a natural hollow," she said. "It's a cover." Together, they cleared enough to reveal a concealed hatch, industrial steel, reinforced, with bolts disguised beneath frozen mud. As Stellan placed his palm against it, he felt it, a faint vibration, rhythmic, steady, unnatural, like a heartbeat that did not belong to anything alive. The sound was subtle, but once heard, impossible to ignore. "Something's running down there," he said. Vargo pressed his ear flat against the metal, muscles trembling. The low hum deepened. The shepherd stepped back, eyes wide, fur lifting along his spine as if the ground itself had breathed. Stellan forced the hatch open with a grunt, cold air rushing upward from below, carrying a metallic tang that stung the nose. A narrow stone stairway descended into darkness.
the walls rough-hewn but reinforced with newer supports, steel beams, cables, lights mounted but currently off. This place had history layered over by recent intent. Maris swallowed.
This was built on something older. And repurposed, Stellan replied. They descended carefully, Stellan first, then Maris, Vargo close behind despite his clear discomfort. The deeper they went, the warmer the air became, not enough to melt snow, but enough to signal machinery working hard below. The hum grew louder, pulsing through the soles of their boots. The tunnel opened into a wider chamber where the ceiling arched low, reinforced by concrete and metal plates bolted hastily into place. Cables ran along the walls, some freshly cut, others buried beneath dirt and debris as if someone had tried to erase their presence in a hurry. That was when they heard the sound. A cough. Weak. Human. Vargo froze, then bolted forward, barking sharply, claws skidding against stone. He stopped near a mound of collapsed earth at the far end of the chamber and began digging furiously. "Help!"
a voice rasped from beneath the rubble.
"Please, don't leave me here." Stellan was already moving, tearing away loose dirt and rock with bare hands. Maris joined him, despite the pain in her ribs, ignoring the cold that bit into her fingers. Slowly, a shape emerged, an arm, then a shoulder, then the gaunt face of a man buried to the chest in soil and broken stone. He looked to be in his early 40s, though exhaustion had etched deeper lines into his features. His hair, once blonde, now hung lank and dirt-matted around his face. Stubble darkened his jaw, and burn marks traced angry red patterns along one forearm where fabric had torn away. His eyes, steel gray, sharp despite the pain, flicked rapidly between them, then locked onto Vargo. "You're not Holst's men," he said hoarsely.
"No," Maris replied. "And you don't look like you are either." Relief washed over his face so quickly it left him shaking.
"Name's Cyrus Venn," he said. "I was supposed to keep the machines running. Then I realized what they were really doing." Stellan braced him carefully as they freed the rest of his body. Cyrus cried out once, then bit it back, pride warring with pain. He was tall but thin, his frame drained by weeks, maybe months underground. The way he held himself suggested someone used to precision, to numbers and systems, not violence. "They said it was research," Cyrus continued, breath hitching. "Signal shielding, environmental data protection. That's how Holst sold it. But that's not what this is." Maris leaned closer. "Then what is it?" Cyrus's eyes darted toward the tunnel behind them, fear flaring. "It's a low-frequency pulse array. Portable units tied into a larger underground system. When it's active, nothing talks. Radios die. GPS scrambles. Aircraft lose orientation. You don't just disappear. You fall." Stellan felt the weight of the device in his pocket, suddenly heavier. "They're testing it." "No," Cyrus said, shaking his head weakly. "They're using it. The testing phase ended months ago." Vargo growled softly, the sound reverberating through the chamber. Cyrus swallowed. "The array protects a winter transport route. Holst's people move restricted materials through the mountains when roads are snowed in and eyes are few. No calls out, no emergency signals. If something goes wrong, the mountains take the blame." Maris closed her eyes briefly. The helicopter, the timing, the sheriff's indifference. It snapped into place with sickening clarity. "And when the power increases?" she asked.
Cyrus's voice dropped to a whisper. Then anything in the air becomes collateral. The hum beneath their feet surged suddenly, stronger, sharper, as if responding to the truth being spoken aloud. Vargo snapped his head up, ears pinning back. He barked once, urgent, then paced in tight circles, claws scraping stone. "They're ramping it up," Cyrus said. "Someone knows I ran." Stellan looked toward the stairway. The silence above felt different now, heavier, charged.
"We can't stay here." "No," Cyrus agreed. "But you need what I hid. Proof, logs, schematics, coordinates. Without them, Holst walks." Maris steadied herself against the wall. "Where?" Cyrus met her gaze. "Deeper in the mountain. A secondary chamber. I never meant to come back for it alone." Vargo pressed his body against Stellan's leg, trembling but resolute, eyes fixed forward. The mountain had revealed its secret, but it had not finished speaking. Above them, the hum continued, steady and merciless, like a machine that did not care who it crushed, as long as silence remained intact. Dusk fell fast in the mountains, the kind of winter dusk that felt less like evening and more like a door slamming shut. The sky above the Garnet Crown Range shifted from pale gray to iron blue in minutes, and the wind returned with purpose, sweeping over the ridges in long, howling breaths. Snow that had rested quietly all afternoon lifted again, skittering across stone and ice like something fleeing exposure. They moved uphill in silence. Cyrus Venn walked ahead, limping slightly, but driven by a focus sharpened by fear and resolve. His thin frame was wrapped in an oversized insulated jacket Stellan had given him, the fabric hanging loose over shoulders that had once belonged to a man who trusted systems more than instincts. Now his steel-gray eyes flicked constantly toward the tree line behind them. Every few steps he paused, listening, measuring the wind, the ground, the invisible pulses he knew too well. "The window won't last long," Cyrus said finally, voice tight. "The array cycles. There's a gap, sometimes 2 or 3 minutes, when the interference drops enough for a satellite handshake. But only up there." He pointed toward a jagged ridge rising above them, bare rock clawing at the sky. Maris adjusted the strap of her equipment pack, pain pulling sharply along her ribs. Her face was pale in the failing light, but her eyes burned with purpose. She had crossed lines before, political, corporate, moral, but never one that cut so cleanly between silence and consequence. "We only need one clean transmission," she said. "After that, they can't put it back underground." Behind them, Vargo moved with heightened intensity, no longer merely alert but charged, as if his entire nervous system had tuned itself to a frequency no human could perceive. His ears snapped forward, then flattened, then lifted again, responding not to sound alone, but to pressure, vibration, the subtle wrongness in the air. His breath steamed in quick bursts, muscles rippling beneath his thick black-gray cream coat as he scanned both sky and stone. Stellan brought up the rear, every step measured, his broad shoulders braced against the wind. The leather of his jacket creaked as he moved, the scars beneath it tightening in the cold. He felt the old familiar pull, the moment when responsibility reasserted itself, unwanted but unavoidable. Once, years ago, he had failed to act fast enough when the signal died. People had paid for that delay. He would not make that mistake again. They reached the ridge just as the sun vanished behind the mountains.
The world dropped away on either side. Frostmere Valley stretched far below like a scattering of dim embers. The wind roared unchecked here, violent and pure, tearing at clothing and breath alike. "This is it," Cyrus said, shouting to be heard.
He crouched beside a flat outcrop, pulling a compact antenna from Maris's pack and helping her anchor it between stones. His hands shook, not from cold alone, but from the weight of knowing what would happen if they failed. Maris powered the transmitter. The screen flickered. Static surged, then dipped. "Come on," she whispered. "Come on." That was when the sound reached them, boots on rock. Stellan turned, just as a figure emerged from the narrow trail below, silhouetted against the dim sky. Sheriff Alden Crail stepped into view, breath visible, pistol raised in a steady, practiced grip. The wind whipped his coat around him, revealing the stiff lines of a man who had spent decades convincing himself that control was the same as order. Up close, the years showed more clearly. The gray in his hair was not the soft kind earned by time, but the brittle kind born of compromise. His face, broad, lined, once commanding, now carried the strain of choices that had narrowed his world until there was no room left to turn. "Step away from the equipment," Crail shouted. "All of you." Maris froze, heart hammering. Cyrus's face drained of color. Stellan stepped forward slowly, hands open but body positioned instinctively between the sheriff and the others. "It doesn't have to end like this, Alden," Stellan said, voice steady despite the wind. "You still have time." Crail's jaw worked. "You don't understand," he snapped. "Holst kept this town alive. Jobs, roads, power. Without him, Frostmere dies." "No," Maris said, raising her voice. "It just stops lying." For a heartbeat, something flickered in Crail's eyes. Doubt, perhaps, or memory. Then it hardened. "Drop the device." That was when Vargo changed. The shepherd lifted his head sharply, ears angling not toward the gun, but toward the ground beneath their feet. A deep vibration rolled through his chest, stronger than before, setting his teeth on edge. The hum, the machine's heartbeat, had surged. Stellan felt it too, faint but unmistakable, resonating through the rock. His breath caught. "The array's spiking," he said. Crail's eyes widened. "No," he whispered, as if realizing too late what he'd agreed to protect. Vargo lunged, not blindly, not in rage, but with perfect timing. He slammed into Crail's arm just as the sheriff pulled the trigger. The shot cracked into the sky, echoing uselessly into the mountains. The pistol skittered across the stone. Stellan surged forward, tackling Crail, pinning him with practiced efficiency. The sheriff struggled briefly, then sagged, the fight draining out of him like air from a punctured tire. "It didn't have to be this way," Stellan said quietly. Crail didn't answer. "Signal!" Cyrus shouted. Maris was already working, fingers flying across the controls. The interference dipped, hard, sudden. The screen cleared. She hit transmit. Data surged outward, video of the wreckage, schematics Cyrus had hidden, coordinates of the underground array, logs stamped with Holst's authorization. The transmitter beeped once, then twice, then locked. "It's out," she breathed. "They've got it." As if summoned by the truth itself, distant rotors cut through the wind. Dark shapes moved against the clouds, federal helicopters, unmistakable even at a distance. Lights swept across the valley, slicing through the night Holst had tried to buy. Below them, Frostmere stirred. Cyrus slumped against the rock, relief breaking through his exhaustion.
"It's done," he whispered. Stellan hauled Krail to his feet as agents crested the ridge moments later, weapons lowered but ready. The sheriff didn't resist. He looked small now, stripped of authority, just another man who had chosen comfort over conscience. By the time the valley filled with flashing lights and voices, the wind began to ease.
Snow settled again, gentle this time, as if the mountain itself had exhaled. Later, much later, Stellan stood alone at the edge of the ridge with Vargo beside him. The dog's posture had softened, tail low but relaxed, eyes calm for the first time since the crash. Below them, Frostmere glowed, not hidden, not silent, but visible. Maris approached quietly. Her face was tired, bruised, alive with something like peace. "You could have walked away," she said. "You tried to." Stellan nodded. "I know. Thank you for not doing it." He looked at Vargo, then back at the valley. "Some warnings aren't meant to be ignored," he said. "Not twice." When the night finally swallowed the mountains whole, Stellan returned to his cabin with Vargo at his side. The world was still dangerous. Truth always was. But the silence that followed was clean. And that was enough. There are moments in life when the world grows loud with excuses and quiet with truth. Moments when it feels easier to look away, to tell ourselves that silence is safer, that someone else will step forward, that one small voice cannot matter against powerful forces. But this story reminds us of something older and deeper. Silence may feel comfortable, but it is never neutral. Stellan did not seek to be brave. Maris did not seek to be fearless. Vargo did not understand power or profit. They simply listened, to conscience, to truth, to instinct. And in doing so, they proved that goodness does not require perfection, fame, or strength beyond our reach. It only requires the willingness to act when a warning appears, especially when turning away would be easier. In our daily lives, we face smaller versions of the same choice. A lie left unchallenged. An injustice brushed aside because it is inconvenient. A neighbor who needs help. A truth that costs us comfort. We may not stand on a frozen mountain or confront hidden machines beneath the earth, but every day asks us quietly, will you protect what is right, even when no one is watching? This story is a reminder that courage often looks ordinary. It looks like honesty. It looks like compassion. It looks like refusing to sell your values for peace that isn't real. And sometimes it looks like listening to that small inner voice, the one that says, "This matters." If this story touched you, if it reminded you of a moment when you had to choose between silence and truth, please share it with someone who may need that reminder today. Leave a comment and tell us where you're watching from and what this story meant to you. And if you want to continue walking with us through stories of resilience, conscience, and quiet faith, please subscribe to the channel so you won't miss the next journey. May God bless you and watch over you. May He guide your steps when the path is uncertain. May He give you the courage to speak when the world asks you to stay silent, and the strength to remain kind in a world that often forgets how. Wherever you are tonight, may peace find you, not the peace of fear, but the peace of truth.